Now, I always think about this as like when somebody's like wondering whether an argument for the existence of God, let's say, is a good argument, or they're critiquing an argument for God, saying, "Oh, that argument's fallacious," or the people who give that argument are not rational. It's like those very thoughts, the thought that something's rational, or the thought that an argument needs to be not fallacious, or that you can even wonder about some things, like that very phenomenon is the very thing that seems to be surprising without a mental foundation.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists, where we learn to be sophisticated in our thinking about Christian philosophy. My special guest today, Dr. Josh Rasmussen. First of all, thank you so much for being here, sir. And my co-host today, Mr. Senor John Dunphy. I don't know why you look embarrassed to be my co-host, but, I would think it would be an honor.
Well, Well, I'm honored to be here with Josh. I don't know if I can say the same thing with Stillman here, but I'm just kidding. By the way,
come now. We have to be very cordial. Our guest is very prestigious, and he is not to be mocked. So, Josh Rasmussen, you sent me.
I thought you were the one being mocked here.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Okay, fine. Well, now you both are teaming up on me. I see how it is. If that's how it's going to go. So I have this article here you sent me. How to build a thought, and I thought this would be a really interesting premise for this video. And me being a layman, not quite getting some of the more technical parts in here that kind of went over my head, admittedly. I'll give you the floor, Josh, to kind of open this up, explain what kind of the premise of the article is.
Okay, yeah. So let me just kind of talk about the big picture. So I've been thinking a lot about thoughts, and thinking about thoughts as part of this bigger question about minds, consciousness, and ultimately why consciousness exists at all. How can there be minds? How can there be thoughts? And so, one of the things that people recognize pretty early on is that they exist, okay? And they have thoughts and they have feelings, and I have kids and they'll tell me what they're thinking about. I'll ask them, like, what are you thinking about? And thoughts are familiar things. But I often tell my students, like, don't confuse the familiar for the insignificant, because the things that are very familiar, when you start focusing on them, you start analyzing like what they are and why they exist, there's treasures of wisdom that you can get just from focusing on the familiar and thinking about why those things are real at all. And so about maybe 10 years ago, I started to think about a certain kind of argument about the nature of thoughts, and specifically whether thoughts are reducible to material states. And one day I was just having a bowl of cereal, and I had this picture just kind of flash in my mind. And this picture is kind of the seed for a series of papers I've written. And this last paper that you cited, How to Build a Thought, that's a co-author with Andrew Bailey, philosopher from Yale, News at Singapore. And so anyway, I was having just this picture in my mind, and the picture had this just kind of material landscape of like dirt and shapes and geometries. And then overlaying that was a conceptual landscape with thoughts and then logical relations connecting those thoughts. And then that picture was kind of a seed for a thought, really, an argument, which has the form of counting. So you count up the possible conceptual configurations, and you compare that number with the possible material configurations, and you see if they're the same or if they're different. Now, both of them are going to be infinite, like you could conceivably have any number of material configurations, and there's not going to be sort of a finite limit to that. But as Cantor showed us, there are different kinds of infinity. And so it occurred to me that if for every material state, there's a logically possible thought about that material state, okay, then you're going to get at least as many thoughts as material states. But then you can actually combine the thoughts using logical relations like or and you can then create more complex thoughts out of these more basic thoughts about the material states. And this is going to allow you to construct a set of possible thoughts that's actually larger, to larger infinity than the set of material states. And if that's right, then the thoughts aren't just entirely and completely one-to-one reducible to material states. There can be thoughts that aren't material because there's more possible thoughts than possible material states. Okay, now this is a kind of first iteration of the argument, and there are some strengths and some weaknesses with that iteration. But I think it's actually helpful for me to kind of build in this way before I get to this paper, because this paper is very technical. So let me just stop right there and just see if you have questions or clarifications about this part of the argument or this kind of phase of thinking.
So I do have some kind of more kind of like devil's advocate questions, but I'll save those for later. The only thing
Okay.
I can think that the more skeptical person might bring up at this point would be kind of a question of, well, if we're talking about conceiving of, say, an infinite like amount of thoughts or series of thoughts, couldn't we just do that with the material? Why does the material, like by definition, have to be limited? Couldn't we also conceive of, an infinite amount of dirt or an infinite amount of, whatever
Yes.
physical parts?
Yes, and that's why I want to say right away, I'm not saying that the material is limited. In fact, I'm going to just assume, in fact, I think it's very plausible that the set of possible material states is going to be infinite.
Okay.
And so then what we're going to do is we're going to see if we can build a set of thoughts that has an infinity that's even bigger. And so this is going to rely on Cantor's theorem. I mean, the basic theorem is that if you have a power set of a power set is a set of all subsets of a set. So, for example, let's take the set of integers. That's an infinite set. But then we could take the power set of the set of integers. That would be the set of all the subsets of integers. So that will include all the singleton sets, the set of the number 1, the set of the number 2, plus all the pairs, the set of 1 and 2, set of 1 and 3, plus all the triples, plus all the, so you get all the set of all the subsets, and that power set will be bigger than the set of integers. So the power set of the integers is a bigger infinity than the set of integers. And so this sort of first iteration of the argument was designed to show that the power set of the physical states is bigger than the set of the physical states. But for every subset of physical states, or more precisely, for every member of the power set of physical states, there is a conceivable thought about that subset of physical states. And so basically what that gives you is it gives you a conceivable thought for every set of physical states. And then again, since there's more sets of physical states than physical states, that gives you a conceivable thought, more conceivable thoughts than physical states. Okay? I know it's pretty technical, but that was sort of the basic insight.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost kind of helpful to go back to that seed picture. It's like that seed picture was, there are just these material configurations, but for any material configuration, there could be a thought about that. Yeah. Plus, you can have the logical or the logical and, combining all those first order thoughts to make more complex thoughts. And I think that's maybe a little more of an intuitive way. Now, so that initial paper, I presented at some different conferences and sent it off to journals, and it did eventually get published. There are certain kinds of objections that come up, and I think kind of one of the most important ones to me is this kind of worry about maybe question begging or sort of circularity. And the reason why this comes up is because it's sort of notoriously difficult to define material state. Like, what is a material state? And if you think that material states include thoughts, because let's say you think thoughts are material, then when you're constructing these thoughts about the material states, you're going to end up running into a certain kind of paradoxes where you get thoughts that refer to themselves. So you get this sort of paradox of self-reference. And I won't unpack that in detail here, but it creates a kind of a worry. Like, am I just kind of assuming my conclusion? I think there are ways to respond to that worry. And I do have this article, I think it's called Building Thoughts from Dust, a Cantorian Puzzle. And I do discuss this. But at the end of the day, I think there is this kind of worry. And so then later I was thinking about a kind of sequel stage to the argument where I'm not just trying to show that like the thoughts aren't reducible to the material states, but there's this further question about where the thoughts actually come from. Can the material states produce the thoughts? And my first kind of thinking about this was realizing, well, look, if there are more possible thoughts than possible material states, there's not enough material states for each one to be able to be a basis. For each thought to have a unique basis for that thought. That was kind of the vague sort of initial thought about that. And then I realized, you know what, I don't actually need to articulate the argument in terms of material states, because I can just leave open the nature of the basis of thoughts, whether they're material or not material. And if I do that, and I just stipulate that, let's just imagine that if thoughts have a basis, the basis is non-mental. So kind of imagine a sort of standard materialist view is going to have it that thoughts come later in the story of reality. So reality sort of begins, or maybe it never begins, but doesn't include a kind of mentality within its fabric. And then later mentality sort of emerges or arises. So you get mind from non-mind. And so then if I define my base as non-mental, then I totally avoid that self-reference worry. Remember, the self-reference worry was that if mind reduces to matter, then thoughts about matter could be thoughts about themselves, potentially, because you're including all the material states and you're saying there could be a thought about all of them. So you're going to get self-reference, but you can avoid that if instead you just let the grounds be non-mental things. Thoughts about non-mental things are not thoughts about mental things. And so since thoughts are mental things, you don't have to worry about thoughts being about themselves. Okay? So I hope that's clear enough, but that's what kind of inspired me to think of this new argument. And I was just like pondering. I remember, I don't know about you, like I don't know how ideas give rise in your mind, but like I remember where I was. Like, so I remember like looking out the window and I was like thinking about it. And then I remember like being at a tree and like going around that tree and just like pondering it. And I was trying to figure out like what the basic principles were from which I could deduce that if Cantor's theorem is true, and if you can build a thought conceivably in terms of any non-mental reality, you can have a thought about that non-mental reality, then you can deduce that you can't get thoughts from non-mental ingredients. And so that's where this article came from. I came up with a set of principles, and then I shared this with my friend Andrew Bailey, who works in the philosophy of mind, and he got pretty excited about it, and he helped me to even kind of clarify the principles as well as draw out the significance of the article. And so it was interesting because I have to just kind of tell you this story. I wrote it up and we sent it off, and the first reviewer, I think it was either the first or the second, they said that they thought the result was actually so significant they didn't think it could be proven. And so they were skeptical that our proof worked. And so I thought, okay, that's interesting. So that's good. It is significant. We just got to tighten our proof. So that's when we decided to symbolize it. You know, you said it was kind of very almost like hard to unpack it, and it is hard. It's hard for me to unpack it. I mean, when I read it, because it's very rigorous. There's a lot of technical stuff in there, but we did that because we wanted it to be precise. And so we did that. I mean, I don't like when people kind of resort to jargon sometimes, because I think they do that sometimes to sort of disguise more maybe hidden complexities or whatever. But in this case, we really wanted it to be technically precise so that you could see that the proof does work, that we could actually establish this result. Now, I wanted to mention this. The goal of the argument is not to show that you're not rational if you don't accept the result or anything like this. It's purely a tool for exploring. Right. And what we do is we show that if these certain axioms, we call them axioms of thoughts, are true, together with some axioms of grounding are true, then you can deduce that thoughts aren't grounded in non-mental stuff. Okay, you can deduce that. So we can look at the axioms if we want to. But and then what we did was we figured out, okay, what would happen if you denied any of these axioms? So we went through axiom by axiom, and we showed that for every axiom, if you deny that, you get a very interesting result. So no matter what you do, you learn something cool and interesting. And so we call this a guide rail. It's a guide rail because it shows that all theories of mind and origin must now, according to this proof, fall within the constraints of either accepting the conclusion or denying one of the axioms. And that's you might think, oh, that's just trivial. I mean, that's how every argument works. You deny the conclusion or one of the premises. But it's not trivial, because what wasn't seen before is that you have to either deny this conclusion or those axioms. And there are theories on the market right now that don't do that. That they will accept. They're inconsistent with that conditional. So it's pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask John if he has any questions, because as you're talking, I was coming with several follow-up questions, but then you kind of just already addressed them, kind of just in passing. So John.
Yeah, so you may have addressed this. First, when you said there are different infinities, do you mean potential and infinite, or is there another definition of infinity that I'm missing?
I think we can leave that open. Now, in the article, we end up quantifying over types. And when I say quantifying over, I just mean we make reference to types of thoughts. And we make reference to types of possible thoughts, whether or not those types are actually instantiated. So we don't mean to imply that, let me say this, we're not committing ourselves to a certain ontology of types. We can leave that open. It's just a matter of translation. So if you want to talk in terms of potential infinities, that's totally fine. You don't have to think that there are any actual infinites. I mean, I guess the caveat is, so long as you can give the translation. I mean, so long as you can give a translation of things that we already have theorems for in mathematics with respect to infinity. So, and I assume that the person who doesn't believe in actual infinites will think that those translations are possible in order to accept those theorems about infinity. So that's. And it's a great question, because I do want to emphasize that the argument, we use language to express the argument, but we have some footnotes to talk about how you can translate this in other systems. So I think it's helpful to know that we're not committed to the particular translation scheme that we use.
Okay, and so there's two positions from my study of philosophy of mind that come up. You mentioned it before, eliminative materialism, which sort of says that, well, mental states really aren't things of aboutness, or they really are just material states that we aren't describing in their material properties that we know of. And then property dualism, which, immaterial or mind comes from matter. So like mental states come from brain states. Which do you think from your studies is most popular in philosophy of mind?
So it would help to kind of get a few different views on the table, then I could answer that. So the eliminativist materialist will eliminate the mental. They'll say there is the material, but they'll eliminate the mental. Then you have the reductive materialist. They say that there is mental, they don't eliminate it. So there are thoughts and feelings, there is consciousness, but they'll reduce it to material states. So both the eliminativist and the reductionist are going to sort of think of matter as sort of the primary reality. But then there's also the non-reductive materialist. So the non-reductive materialist doesn't reduce the mental to the material and doesn't eliminate the mental, but still the material is primary. And there are different ways of sort of spelling out how it's primary, but you can sort of think of it like in terms of sort of determination. So that if you fix the material reality, then the mental reality sort of arises out of that material reality. That's not the only way to describe this, but those would be kind of the main sort of articulations on the materialist side. I should say that even within reduction, there's some distinctions here. So there's sort of like a type reduction, there's token reduction, and then there's a sort of a functionalist reduction. And then on the non-reductionist side, there's also, you can be a functionalist, non-reductive, a physicalist as well. So there's kind of a whole variety of views there. And then on the dualist side, there's kind of roughly, you could distinguish between property dualism and substance dualism. So on property dualism, you have some mental properties, but they aren't reducible to or the same as just material properties. On substance dualism, you are not even a material substance, so you're some kind of immaterial substance. And there's other views as well on the dualist side, but I think it's helpful to kind of spell out those views. And actually, once you start getting very precise about them, there's ways in which some of these views kind of bleed together. So, for example, I mean, a property dualist can be a non-reductive physicalist, because you could think that some of the mental is not material, but you could think that your fundamental properties are material. But as soon as you say that you have some fundamental properties that are fundamentally mental, okay, and they're not just sort of fixed by the material or determined by the material, now you're starting to kind of stray from the kind of standard materialist picture. Now, I also want to be careful here to not suggest that therefore you can't call yourself a materialist or a physicalist. In graduate school, I had a professor who, his view, he was moved by the arguments to think that your mind is real, you've got thoughts and feelings, and they're not reducible to patterns of particles or chemical reactions. And not only that, but they don't even depend deterministically on physical stuff. In fact, he argued that they have kind of like novel powers, kind of top-down causal powers. But he would still call himself a physicalist or materialist in kind of a broad sense, in that you are a material substance, even if you have these mental properties that aren't material and they have top-down causal powers. Okay, that's just kind of a brief introduction to kind of a lay of the land. And I'm very glad you asked this question, because I think oftentimes people get into the arguments and get into the debates, and it feels like there's just two views. There's like the spooky, religious view where you posit ghosts in the machine, or you have this kind of like scientific view where it's like neuroscience. We found out that, consciousness is connected to the brain. You don't have a ghost in there, And I think that's kind of the sort of popular level distinction. And I want to just kind of make it clear that there's a whole panoply of views here. As far as like kind of what's the most common in the philosopher, so there's the Phil surveys, which talks about what philosophers of mind tend to think about the different views. And definitely there's a general leaning towards physicalism. As far as what form of physicalism, there's kind of a variety there. And in my history of the philosophy of mind, it seems like this is a rough sketch, kind of goes like this. We sort of start off by toying with what's called logical behaviorism, where we actually analyze the meaning of mental terms in terms of behavioral terms. And then that didn't really work, so we moved to ontological behaviorism, where we don't just reduce the meaning of mental terms, we sort of analyze the mental states in terms of behavior. And that didn't really work. Then we moved on to sophisticated forms of type identity theory, which tended to give way to functionalism. And then there turns out to be, after that, kind of a split between whether philosophers think that you can maintain a kind of reductive physicalism. My sense is the trend is toward non-reductive physicalism. And then after that, it's kind of a split again over whether the mental properties have novel powers. And so that's kind of my general sense of the landscape of thinking about this. And then where my article comes in, or our article with Andrew Bailey, is that we're not cutting against every physicalist view. What we're doing is we're actually just arguing against this purely bottom-up, non-mind to mind view. You have somebody like David Chalmers, for example, and he thinks there is a kind of proto-mentality built into the foundation of reality. And I think that's definitely in the right direction, that there is a kind of mental reality built into the foundation of reality, at least if the conclusion of our article is correct, and you can't get mind deterministically from just non-mental ingredients.
I have a devil's advocate question that just popped up in my head. It just arose from my brain state.
Indeterministically. Yeah. I'm just teasing.
So what if they accuse you of the fallacy of composition? Well, sure, not every atom and mental thing that makes up my brain has mental properties to it, but why should we therefore conclude that it can produce something mental?
Yeah, so maybe it could, and there would be a kind of fallacy. Now we have to look at there'd be a fallacy depending on what my argument is. Okay, so this is why I kind of have to look at the actual argument. So if the production there is not deterministic, so you have, let's say, some particles, and there's not a deterministic link from those particles to a mental state, then that's okay as far as our argument goes. You can have non-deterministic causation, as far as our argument goes. And so, I mean, yes, go ahead.
Could you give an example of, maybe in general and with your argument, of a non-deterministic causal effect, I guess?
So let's say that your brain sort of enters into a certain state and a certain chemical reaction takes place. And then maybe there's a kind of probabilistic law that says, given that chemical reaction, you'll start feeling love towards me. I don't know, whatever it is, towards a friend. Maybe it's like 50% chance. Okay. And so, so you enter into that state, the chemical reaction occurs, and it just doesn't happen. No love occurs. Okay. But then maybe the next day you enter into that same exact material configuration, exact same one, but then love occurs after that because there's just a 50% connection. Now, I want to clarify, my view is that laws themselves are not material states. So if there is this probabilistic law that governs that material state, then I actually already think that you have something immaterial that's, in a sense, working with the material to give you the love there. But, there's different views about the nature of the laws. But, I mean, so that would be a way in which, as far as this argument from counting in that article goes, we don't rule out the scenario that chemical reactions could indeterministically produce thoughts or feelings. But we focus on thoughts.
But not consciousness in general, or consciousness proper itself wouldn't be produced from material states. Just certain thoughts and so on could be. Even
we leave that open. I mean, this article leaves that open, right? I mean, so there's another kind of argument, sort of the Chalmers hard problem of consciousness argument, where you sort of just consider the nature of chemical reactions, and you consider the nature of feeling, and it just sort of looks like you can't get the one from the other. It's like the other day, my son had a birthday and he had some balloons hanging, and then I took a couple of his balloons and I just like put them together, and I was like, would this produce a thought? Just putting them together. I asked them, are these balloons a thought? And they're like, no. Could I make a thought by smashing the balloons together? And you might think this is sort of a naive question, but I mean, you just sort of consult your intuitions, and somebody like Chalmers is going to say, no, in principle, you can't get sort of what it's like to be you just by smashing third-person material parts. So that's a different argument, but you could make that argument as well. Yes.
I think thoughts could be produced perhaps from mental states, but I think what we do with those in our sort of more higher awareness and beliefs, I think beliefs are ultimately a combination of our thoughts put together through more thinking and so on. So I don't think those are produced from material brain parts or atoms, however the materialists would want to say.
The beliefs are produced from your thoughts? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. We're a thinking thing, as Descartes would say, and we sort of have this subsistent or not emergent property of us, of mind, and that sort of works with our thoughts and creates our beliefs and so on. Sort of almost like a John Locke view of a blank slate, almost.
Yeah. But then the thoughts themselves, how do they arise?
I'm saying they could be, perhaps from this probabilistic law as you described, but those aren't all of my mental states, I guess. Because
I see. Yeah.
Moreland and other philosophers of mind sort of give 5 different mental states, like feelings, thoughts, beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I think will and action, intentions and so on.
Yeah, and there are important distinctions there because, for example, Jaegwon Kim in his book Physicalism or Something Near Enough, he has the something near enough there because he gives a functional analysis of thoughts, I believe. But then there's this other thing, this sort of feeling aspect, and he doesn't find a way to give an analysis of that in terms of physics. And so he leaves that, or even functional. He doesn't even give a functionalist analysis. So that's, I think, the near enough part. He's got this extra stuff. Yeah.
I'm done with my line of questioning.
Okay.
Okay, so that's good. So I guess kind of moving towards the end. So okay, we have all this information. Or maybe I could pose the question like this. What would you say is sort of the fundamental problem, or the fundamental kind of impediment or stumbling block to someone trying to kind of build consciousness, or even just thoughts, starting from a strictly materialistic framework? Like, what would you like? You have maybe just a brief couple of minutes to explain this to somebody who's trying to put this forth. What do you say is like their main problem or obstacle?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a kind of like one main problem, but sort of when I think about it, and I can only kind of tell you what it's like when I think about it, because what might seem sort of problematic to me may completely legitimately not seem problematic to somebody else. So I always want to encourage people to sort of follow the light that they have, and sort of think about it in their own terms. And I think that's the most helpful thing. But so when I think about it, I think about these sort of different aspects of thoughts. And so I mean, rationality, for example, people want to have a rational thought. So then there's a question like, well, how do you get rationality from non-rationality, especially if you think about your current state right now being produced right now by particles, a swarm of particles moving around? Are these motions of the particles themselves intrinsically rational?
Yeah.
Okay. What does that really mean? So that would be like a question to kind of think about, like it may be a problem. It's not to say it's unsolvable or unanswerable, but it's like just this question, like how do you get the rationality from the non-rationality? And then you also have the aboutness of a thought. So like I can think about the moon, and sometimes people say, well, aboutness, we can analyze that in terms of representation. And you think of like a map, for example. But the thing that's kind of tricky when you think about representation is that when you look at a map and you see, okay, this map is about the city is about the city because a mind has assigned like the key and says, okay, this means that, this means that. So the map sort of gets its representative nature in virtue of something else that has representation in a more basic way.
Apart from that, it would just be lines and ink and
lines. Yeah, it's like, how do you get from lines and shapes this aboutness? How do you get meaning from just non-meaning? These sorts of things. And then of course the consciousness aspect, the quality or quale aspect of a thought. It's sort of what it's like to have that thought. And that's one of those things where I think sometimes people are puzzled, like, why are they known for like denying that they exist or that there are thoughts? Why are there eliminativist materialists? And we could talk about, different reasons, and the reasons can be sophisticated and important to think about. But to be honest, it looks to me that one of the reasons is because philosophers are taking seriously the reality of consciousness. Like when you really think about what it is and you start thinking about how can there be this in a material world, well, that kind of thinking can lead you to think, well, maybe there couldn't be this in a material world. And so there isn't this. When I say in a material world, I mean a fundamentally material and mindless world. There's no mind at the foundation of things. So, okay, so let me just kind of summarize this here. So when I think about thoughts and when I think about maybe problems for materialism, I think of the properties of thoughts. And in order for me to even investigate what those properties are and the extent to which they might be a problem for materialism, or to explore possible solutions, I have to actually use two different powers. And I really kind of maybe want to land on this because these are powers that aren't included among your five senses, but these are very important powers that you need to use in order to investigate some of the most significant questions of life. One of them is the power of introspection, that sort of inner light by which you can see that you have thoughts and feelings. Like, so right now I'm not using any of my five senses, my eyes or ears or whatever, to detect my thoughts. I'm not looking at my brain. I've never even seen my brain. Right? So like, I think I have a brain. I've got evidence for it, but my brain's invisible to me. What's not invisible to me are my thoughts. Okay, that's not invisible by the light of introspection, but I have to actually use that introspective power. I met a philosopher once. He wasn't so sure that power was reliable, and so that led him to doubt whether he himself existed. And it's like, okay, well, that kind of shows the point. You've got to use that power to verify your own existence. And then the other is this light of reason. And reason includes logic, but it goes beyond logic because it includes principles that may not have already been incorporated in our recognized canons. And so you use reason to make deductions. For example, you can deduce that if you're aware of your thoughts right now and you're not directly aware of the pattern of particles in your brain, then you can use reason to deduce that there's something true of your thoughts that's not true of the pattern of particles in your brain. And then by reason, if there's something true of A that's not true of B, it follows that A is not B. Because if A is B, then whatever's true of A is true of B. Okay, and you have to actually use reason. And that particular argument invites its own analysis, but then you have to use reason to go through that analysis. And so introspection and analysis are the tools you got to use to really investigate your thoughts, what they are, what their implications are, and then how they could fit in a material world.
Yeah. I think if anyone ever says to you there are no thoughts, you should just say, what a strange thought. Yeah.
Right.
Funny way to...
I remember reading an article somewhere, and it was like, I'm pretty sure they started off by saying, I believe that there are no beliefs, and I think that there are no thoughts. And then later in the article, they said, of course, because they understood what they were doing. Right. When I say belief, I mean belief star. And then they gave a functionalist, materialist analysis of belief, belief star. And they said, belief star is not the sort of ordinary meaning of belief that you have in mind when you use the word belief. I don't think there are any of those things. There's this other thing. And so, I mean, you can be cute and say, oh, it's self-defeating, but I mean, they know that.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. So, well, you mentioned it there, the solutions. Okay, so we have this big problem of it doesn't, or at least doesn't seem intuitive that we can build thoughts from non-mental, the non-mental being the fundamental building blocks. So what would you propose as the solution?
Well, okay, so I mean, here I think Chalmers is taking us in the right direction. He's saying you've got to have something sort of categorically like consciousness. You need mental resources in the fabric of the foundation of things. And let me just add here, kind of in summary, the problems can be divided into in-principle problems and probability problems. So the in-principle problem would say, in principle, you can't get consciousness by smashing particles together. The probability problem would just say, you wouldn't just expect if you take any random balloons and you smash them together, that'll produce a feeling. You wouldn't expect that probabilistically. Okay, and I say balloons, but just multiply the examples. Take any random particles and smash them, put them through the accelerators and the colliders, and smash them. You wouldn't expect them to thereby produce a person. Okay, and so there's both the sort of expectation or probability problem and the in-principle problem. And then the solution I propose in my work is that is again kind of along the lines of Chalmers, that there is a kind of fundamental reality that includes the mental resources, intentionality, which then solves both the in-principle problem, because there's the right resources, as well as the prediction or probability problem, because it increases the expectation that reality would unfold to result in beings like us, who can think and feel and wonder about the nature of reality. Now, I always think about this as like when somebody's like wondering whether an argument for the existence of God, let's say, is a good argument, or they're critiquing an argument for God, saying, oh, that argument's fallacious, or the people who give that argument are not rational. It's like those very thoughts, the thought that something's rational, or the thought that an argument needs to be not fallacious, or that you can even wonder about something. It's like that very phenomenon is the very thing that seems to be surprising without a mental foundation. Mm-hmm. And perhaps even impossible.
Yeah, so this has been very interesting stuff, and I'm really glad we did this, because it's helped because I read the article and again had a tough time digesting some of it, so this has been really helpful to me. We are going to move to a web extended to discuss maybe what some of the implications would be for Christian theism and some of the stuff you talked about in your book, How Reason Can Lead to God, predictive power of the two worldviews. Maybe even if you could build thoughts from strictly material world, building blocks, would that even be predicted on a materialistic framework? I don't think it would be. But so to see that, people are going to have to head on over to subscribestar.com/TUA. You get access to all the bonus content there, some with Cameron Bertuzzi, Braxton Hunter, a debate I had with David Paulman. But before we go, I do want to plug the YouTube channel Worldview Design, the book How Reason Can Lead to God. I highly, highly recommend it. Go on Amazon, any other place you can get books to get that book. Is there anything I'm missing there?
Sounds good.